rather than getting terribly worried about, well, how do we go and target this group? How do we go and do such and such? A much better policy is to go, how do I make this thing famous? And that's why I think the wine business on the whole should ban the use of the word consumers and endlessly talk about audiences.
I like to read your texts and everything you publish because it's engaged. You tell stories. It's not very technical.
I think wine communication is this really interesting area now where it's much easier to be a communicator. It's also really important that we have really good communicators.
Yes. For me, it's interesting is actually because the way you see things. I think you read much more than just wine books, and you read lots of the other stuff. And you can actually put in some dot points can make lots of sense.
But one of those bits is when I talk to people and they say, well, I'd like to be a wine communicator. I say, well, count up the number of letters in wine and communicator. Roughly, that's how much time and effort you need to put into those two bits. More than twice as much of your time ought to be on being a brilliant communicator than on wine.
Let's talk about luck.
That's extraordinarily profound and important question.
Hello, guys, and welcome to another podcast with Joe this time. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. He's on the other side of the world. It's very far from Australia, but I'm so glad you could make this. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation, because your knowledge it's very valuable for our community, and I'm very glad you are here with us today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. You must forgive me. I'm in a co-working space. It's the start of the day in Stockholm, in Sweden. It's a particularly nice day as well. We're enjoying the final bits of sun because winter comes a little earlier here. So, no, I'm thrilled. And as you I think in our own conversations, you've discovered I quite like talking. So the chance to just come and sit and start my day chatting to somebody for an hour is an absolute joy. Don't worry, viewers. It won't all be, or listeners, it won't just be for an hour. I'm sure that Priscilla will cut out an awful lot of nonsense. But no, I'm absolutely sure. I've got to talk about wine,
Yeah, the two things that's we want to talking about all the polemic things, because we want to make people rethinking. And what I love about what you write in your texts and everything, I'm a big follower of you, what you do. And you always making people thinking, like maybe people think it different. But you have a very good story how we started in the wine industry, because you started as a TV shows. Yeah, tell us a little bit your story.
Yes, I have this very unusual. There's actually a great friend of mine, also a brilliant podcast guest. Actually, there's a guy called Rory Sutherland who. He's the vice chairman of Ogilvy in London, and we've got to know each other. Largely, it's one of those interesting things that I am a great wine advocate, and he thinks that wine is a waste of time. A lot of it, you'd rather have gin and tonic, which means we get on very well because we're sort of often slightly have that sort of challenge. And I think one of those things that's going to come through, whenever I have conversations, is often that sense of there's an element of challenge or of conflict or questioning, not just for its own sake, but often because good ideas come out of it. One of his great lines is that you should be good at two things. He said, if you want to have a successful career, be good at two things. And funnily enough, when it comes to the world of wine communication, when I've now been very lucky, I've been a wine TV presenter, probably the biggest wine TV show in the world. We got to about 100 million people, 110 countries or something. So it's a big show, still on. In fact, it's on 3 times a week in Sweden. So that's sort of on all the time. But one of those bits is when I talk to people and they say, well, I'd like to be a wine communicator. I say, well, count up the number of letters in wine and communicator. Roughly, that's how much time and effort you need to put into those two bits. More than twice as much of your time ought to be on being a brilliant communicator, or not brilliant, but a better communicator than on wine. To be honest, once you've got your diploma, and if you do diploma, you there was a great statistic years ago. I remember I went and did the commencement speech or the graduation speech for the WSET diploma class. And there's often that line, people say more people have been in space than have passed the Master of Wine exam. As this example of how extraordinarily hard it is. It's also true that more people around the world have a functioning, working knowledge of the Large Hadron Collider than have passed the WSET diploma. The diploma itself puts you into a very, very small group of extraordinarily knowledgeable, skilled people in the world of wine. If you have the diploma, then after that, mostly what you should be doing is thinking, how do I write better? How do I talk better? How do I communicate better? Notice there, I did it in threes. You go away and you learn things like the rule of threes, that you tend to go and present things in threes. So I had this twin track career. I was very lucky. I never wanted to be a wine writer at all. I never wanted to work in wine. I wanted to be a soldier, but they turned me down very flatly twice. So I ended up going and teaching. I taught in university for quite a long time. And when I was at university, I was just quite into wine. I'd worked in wine shops and I'd been a sommelier as a young guy. And it was a strange thing, because what is allowed then was for me to go and start writing a newspaper column, writing articles. So I wrote a newspaper column in Scotland for a long time, about 14 years, on wine, and presented a TV show actually about food. It was called Joe's Diner. I used to present quite a lot of, and it was little bits. Often you wouldn't get paid very much. But and remember, this is a long time ago. This is 25, 26, almost possibly even 30 years ago. I was presenting these TV shows. I presented a music show called The Beat Room, where I once interviewed somebody wearing a liver on my head as a wig, and there was blood dripping off my nose all the way through. And I used to have a radio show called It's Your Money, which was about personal finance, because I've been researching it at university. This was almost entirely on the BBC, so BBC Scotland. And one of those areas, when people come in, you go just find every opportunity you can to sit in front of an audience and interview people and sort of do daft stuff, especially if you're young, you can get away with it. And so I was doing all this kind of alongside, and then I was working as a wine merchant. So after university, I was teaching at university. I became a wine merchant. I worked for Matthew Clark in the UK. In fact, not selling wine at all. I was selling vodka and beer to really rough pubs. I once went into a pub. I went to go and take an order. It's a place called the District Bar, and it's on a place called Paisley Road West. Anybody who knows Glasgow will know Paisley Road West. And they couldn't give me the order, and I asked why, and she said because they'd found a dead terrorist in one of their lavatories, and somebody had been murdered overnight. It was a real education. There were pubs I couldn't go into because it was too dangerous, because they were really, really hardcore sort of terrorist pubs. I was once tracked by Special Branch, the sort of police force in the UK, and there was an undercover unit tracking one of my customers, and I went to have lunch with him, and they tracked me and they traced my car, and at work I was pulled to one side and interviewed about why I'd had lunch with this very well-known sort of essentially kind of not a hitman, but an enforcer for one of Glasgow's big gangsters. And they said, "Do you know him outside of work?" I said, "Yes, he's coming to mine for Christmas." And the guy went white. So all our children are at school together. It was absolutely horrifying. This guy was a proper villain. It was great fun. He was also very nice. It was great fun. I remember he used to use creme de la mer face moisturizer. He was the guy who told me that if you should never go and bring the phone that you maintain contact with your girlfriend home. He said, if you're having an affair, you have one phone that you can take home that you talk to your wife on, but the one that you talk to your girlfriends on, he says, you put it in a locked drawer on a Friday night, and then they just know they can't speak to you till Monday. Interesting things that you learn when you're out and about. So I'd had this sort of strange twin track career. So on one side, I was a wine merchant. I worked for Matthew Clark and Bibendum, a very innovative wine merchant in the UK, and then Berry Brothers and Rod in London, the Royal Queen's wine merchant, the King's wine merchant now, on the corner of St James's, probably the oldest wine merchant, certainly in the UK, possibly the world. It was opened in 1698 by the widow Bourne. Extraordinary place to work. So I'm now working my way through and becoming sales director or whatever. And on the side, I'm writing a wine column and doing bits of TV and so on. But then, it was a while back, I got a Twitter DM. And the way I ended up doing the wine show, and luck is a big part of it.
But let's talk about luck.
So the lucky part, I mean, you do make your own luck. So anybody who wants to be a wine communicator.
How did you beat that your luck?
So what happened was I was judging the first ever Argentine Wine Awards. So I was taken to Argentina. And on the last day, they said, we're taking you to a spa. So we judged the awards. We'd all given some speeches. It was all very nice. And we were taken to this wine spa. And I'm not a spa kind of guy, really. And I remember Jancis Robinson was having a massage. And I think Robert Joseph and somebody else, was it Robert Joseph? Was having remember Oz Clarke went in, had a twin massage with another man. They went into the couples suite, but they knew each other so well they didn't mind having massages together in the couples suite. And I went and had a bath of wine. I remember it's a Bonarda bath of wine. So you sort of got into this bath of wine. And I had a bit to drink. So I set up this video camera. It was before phones, really. And I put this video camera at the end of the bath. And I'm chatting into the camera and saying, well, I'm having a marvellous time here. I'm in a bath of wine with a glass of wine. Isn't this lovely? Apparently, it's very good for my skin, you know, hoping I don't do up periscope halfway through with my widdly whatnot. And so they filmed this thing. And I put it on YouTube. And completely forgot about it. Now, bear in mind, I probably put it on YouTube around, I mean, this is 10 years before we made the wine show. I don't know when YouTube began. It was 2007, something like that, 2008. So anyway, I put it on YouTube and totally forgot about it, as indeed did the rest of the world. Nobody ever watched it. I mean, I think in 10 years, it maybe had something like less than 100 views. And as it
and
happens,
they saw that.
A TV producer is looking for a presenter and what she was looking for something quite specific. She didn't want an established face or name. So, you know, as much as, you know, Oz or Susie Barry or, you know, endless people are very good and well-established. Karen McNeil, you know, they're great established talents. She said, actually, I wanted somebody who's kind of new. And she said, I wasn't really looking for a presenter. What I wanted was a wine merchant, you know, somebody who was the sort of person you met in the street. And it came up on the side. It said, you know, you may also be interested in this guy here.
Maybe like it became
she
like
got
a
in touch
thing.
on Twitter.
It became like a thing. So he's a wine merchant.
Yeah.
He's actually having YouTube.
Exactly. It was like, you may also like this. And she clicks on it and she goes, oh my goodness, I found this guy. But how do we find him? Because at that point, you know, I wasn't doing any TV or writing at all. I was running a sales team. I was director of sales at Spabendum, looking after a team of people, living as it happens in London. And, you know, she got in touch. When she did get in touch, we were filming within 10 days. So we went away. We filmed a pilot where I bought a barrel of wine at the Vendée Vins in Burgundy, in the big auction. I went and it was terrifying. And they sort of gave me €7,000 and said, right, go away and buy a barrel of wine on camera. So, okay, there you go.
So how was for you, like the feeling for, you know, because when you're in TV, you have the pressure, like the whole people are going to see you, and then people are going to love you. People probably, you know, going to judge you because we are humans. You didn't have that feeling, like you things like going your way, and how we're talking and how people actually interpret it. I don't know, because for me it's such a thing, like in the social media these days, I don't even know what people are gonna expect. Everything, every time I write something, it's just like, oh my god, I'm not sure if people is gonna take it the wrong way or good way. I guess in TV is kind of the same, because you never know like how people are gonna interpret it. How did you get this over? Like, how did you behave on TV, and how did you didn't have, like, we're not scared to do it?
That's extraordinarily profound and important question. And there is a part you will, if you are not slightly nervy about doing it, then, you know, just having a slight sense of wanting it to be good. I mean, it's not, I think it's that difference between wanting this to be really good and to have an impact, and being utterly terrified that it will be terrible. And those are two slightly different things, actually. And our natural tendency is, I don't want this to be terrible. And we do live in a world, I'm very, very lucky, really, when I look back, that my earliest time in broadcasting and writing was before social media. I think social media has made it much harder, because social media makes it much easier for you to hear people's critique. You know, when the first TV shows, when I made The Beat Room, and I had to do I was essentially acting in it, and I had to play the character of, and you probably wouldn't do it now, but this sort of rather lounge Lothario guy. And I remember, and I was wearing this dreadful outfit, and the Scotsman gave me my first ever TV review, and it just had this immortal line, Joe Fattorini is sweatily lascivious, which is a cutting phrase. Now, I saw one guy in one newspaper, there's one line where he goes, Joe Fattorini is sweatily lascivious and a rather disgusting character. Of course, now if you multiply that across endless social media platforms, it means essentially for like 2 months, you've got people going, oh my goodness, you're terrible. And that's really, really damaging, and that's sort of very hurtful, which is why actually it's easier if you shut that down. what I would say is the earlier you start and the more you get into it, it does help. So we had a pirate radio station when I was at school. So we were like 16 and making radio programs. And in fact, of the people in that now, not only I'm a broadcaster, Mark Barton, very successful career as a financial journalist. There's 2 or 3 others who had brilliant careers. Godwin, who used to play around on it, is Brad Pitt's sort of intellectual property and libel lawyer. he took that experience and turned it into being a staggeringly successful libel lawyer, probably because we were immensely libelous when we were making the show. And then very quickly I made a show, Joe's Dino, when I was my early 20s, which was a food show. And at that point, when you're in your early 20s, you're kind of daft and you don't really care. You just go do stuff. And somebody says, can you make a TV program about food heritage in the north of England? Yes, absolutely. The first
you didn't even think, you didn't even scared.
I remember the first national radio show I did. There's a guy, I was in university, the phone rang, and it's one of my colleagues, lovely guy, Ronnie Smith, and he picked up the phone, and he was a great expert on what's known now as sort of heritage tourism, and particularly sort of one of our colleagues invented the term dark tourism, where people go and visit, like Auschwitz or the grassy knoll or so on. Dom Jolly, the writer, wrote a really good book about it. And John Lennon, also as it happens called John Lennon, he invented this. So we were quite well known for really interesting tourism research. And so Ronnie was a heritage tourism expert. He took this phone call in the office and they said, oh, can you come on the radio and talk about heritage tourism? And Ronnie was like, no. And he hung the phone up. And in those days, what you could do, you could pick up the phone and you could dial, in Britain, you could dial 1471 and it would connect you to the last person to have rung. So I dialed 1471 and it connected me back and it was like, hello, this is the BBC. This is Current Affairs Units. And I said, oh, hello, is that BBC? Yes, it is. And I look back now at the sort of complete chutzpah of it all. And I said, I believe you're looking for somebody to talk about heritage tourism. I just overheard this conversation. I said, we are, yes. Are you one? Yes. I said, oh, really? Well, I'm also at the university and I teach tourism classes, which was true. And I said, yes, I'd be delighted to come on. So they said, yeah, can you come on tomorrow at 12 o'clock? Now, this is a kind of lunchtime. So I had 24 hours. In those 24 hours, I remember it was the holidays. The students weren't around who were just doing research. So I went downstairs, bought 3 books on heritage tourism. I speed read them overnight.
What?
Turned up in this BBC studio the next day at lunchtime, having speed read 3 books on heritage tourism. And I did this interview.
Books in 24 hours.
Yeah, so 24 hours. I was absolutely shredded by the time I got in there. I was completely knackered. So I give this interview on heritage tourism. And this is where you kind of make your own luck, because it went down very well. The interviewer actually was known for being a really hard interview. He was tough. He'd been really well briefed. He had great notes. So if I just tried to wing it, I would have been hung out to dry. But actually, I was able to do stuff. And I said, well, no, X, Y, Z in 1972, he went and cited this. I had some funny quotes. I was able to come up with all these various elements. And as it happens, there's a lady called Katie Lander, who's a BBC producer. That's a really interesting quirk here. Katie Lander's brother is married to Jancis Robinson. So you start to find these weird connections. Katie Lander is listening in her office to this interview, and she goes, this guy sounds quite interesting. And he seems to really know his stuff. And he's telling these funny stories in an otherwise quite serious sort of interview. So she then rings up a producer, a guy called Gary Hollywood. And she said, Gary, we've got to get him on this other show. So then I got this phone call. So then I ended up getting a weekly slot on a program called The Fred McCauley Show. Fred was a comedian. Well, because then I spent 5 years, once a week, getting a little masterclass in how to do, essentially, not being a comedian, but how to go and carry interesting, light-hearted morning drive time radio. I used to go in once or twice a week, and I presented it once or twice. So you get that, and then of course Katie's knows Jancis, and so we end up making that connection, and then Katie gets me to other bits, and those things kind of spiral out. So you do have to do the thing, and sometimes it's worth your while. Now, when you sort of think, oh crikey, was it worth your while staying up all night and reading 3 books? For that interview, probably not. For what spins out of it. The one thing I would say, and I see this particularly in a lot of young writers today, is there's almost this default when people do stuff. They go, okay, I've got massive imposter syndrome, but I'm just going to put this thing out there, and this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And why are you telling me this? Why are you telling me that you don't think you're any good at this? You don't really want to do it. You're actually not wildly comfortable going and doing it. And I think people do that because then if it all turns out rubbish, they can say, well, I told you it was rubbish. I told you it was fine. And there's no, you don't have to climb down from that. You know, if you're rubbish, you might have to actually climb down a bit. I've done things where I was rubbish and you just have to go, I'll be honest with you, I was terrible at that. It's like really bad. You know, I've failed 2 doctorates. I'm pretty rubbish at doing doctorates, it has to be said. But you've got to go into it with some sort of confidence, certainly in the world of wine communication. I know we're sort of rambling around, you know, we're not really sort of digging into wine, but I think wine communication is this really interesting area now where it's much easier to be a communicator. It's also really important that we have really good communicators.
Yes,
It's very important those communicators come in different places. And I'd love to see people going into it with more bravura and confidence, but also going into it not with a sense of, you know, you often get that thing of, well, I did English when I was at school, so I know how to write. Actually, studying Jane Austen will not help you be a good writer. It doesn't a bit, you know, absolutely. But actually going away and reading Steven Pinker's Sense of Style will give you massively more insight, you know, learning about copyright, you know, reading copywriters, going and, you know, looking at, I know, sort of narrative structure in some of David Lodge's non-fiction books. These are the kind of things that are really going to kind of help you. Actually just writing inordinately large amounts of stuff and getting it rejected. When I wrote the newspaper column, and it was a very old way of doing it, I first co-wrote with a guy called Tom Shields, and he and I just got drunk once. We got terribly drunk. And when I woke up the next day, and I don't remember going to bed or anything. I remember we went out for lunch, and the next day I woke up in my flat and I had written down, fortunately, on a post-it note that we'd agreed to write 2 wine columns together. And he said, well, you know about wine and I know about writing, but neither of us knows the other person's skill set, so we'll do this together. So you write the column, I'll make it publishable, and we'll split the money. Because he had a tax bill to pay, I think. And so we wrote these 2 columns in the run-up to Christmas, and we gave them to a lovely lady called Kate Devine, who's still a brilliant journalist and so on. She's an extraordinary journalist. And she really liked them. And then remember, we got to the 3rd week, and Tom and I were in the pub in Glasgow, and he said, let's just do a 3rd one and just send it in and see if she notices. So I sent this column in, and she said, oh, great, yeah, that's it. We'll put that on the page. And we just kept doing it. And when I left 14 years later, remember they said, we're going to have to check your contract to see how long a kind of notice period you have to give us. And I said, there is no contract. Said, but you've been writing for us for 14 years. Surely there is something written down. Absolutely not. So it just started us in a pub, and we would write this stuff down in longhand. And it was a great way of writing, actually, because you'd write in longhand, and we would have all these bits, and I would say, oh, we should recommend this. And I've just tried this wine, you know, it's really good, and that fits in the column. And then we would go to the bar in this pub, and the barman would give us a telephone. And this was before, you know, you could email, but it's kind of hard. You couldn't do it on your phone. We would ring it in. So you'd phone up the copy taker in the press, and it'd be this old Glaswegian lady, hey, hen, where you in? Okay, go ahead, right? And then you'd dictate the copy. And these women who sort like that, I need bother, they talk away like this. But their English, of course, was immaculate. So they would correct you as you went through, and they'd sort of question your punctuation. Because you have to sort of say, you know, comma, exclamation mark, no exclamation marks, never exclamation marks. So you'd be in a busy pub with a pint, you know, sort of dictating this copy. And then the extraordinary thing was the bar was actually set into the building where the newspaper offices were. And I remember once or twice you'd hear this thing in about 20 minutes, half an hour even. Sometimes if we were close to copy deadline, it wouldn't be very long, certainly maybe an hour afterwards, the whole bar would start to shake and all the drinks would start rattling. And it was because it was the rollers of the printing press were starting directly above your head. And every so often now, if I ever see old school films, there's that film, The Post, and I remember seeing and it makes puts my hair, all my hairs go up. Oh, it's amazing. So yeah, that was how I started writing. Tom and I wrote together for 2 years, and then I wrote on my own for 12. And what would happen is each week I would write a column, and it would get slightly better each week. And it was like having your homework marked by the world's drunkest, angriest school teacher, because he would sort of sit there, and he's old Glaswegian, not old, it's probably younger than I am now, but he was you know, sort of hard Glaswegian journalists, sort of School of Hard Knocks, and you're like, that's terrible, get that, it's sort of leather, and then you'd gradually hone your column. And people do, it's very nice. Somebody said the other day, he said that my Substack, he said, was the only one he ever read to the end. He said, there's nothing stopping me getting there.
I guess for me to actually get engaged for any reading these days, it needs to be something like engaged. I like to read your texts and everything you publish, because it's engaged. You tell stories. It's not very technical, and there's some things like for me it's interesting is actually because the way you see things. I think you read much more than just wine books, and they read lots of the other stuff, and you can actually put in some dot points can make lots of sense. So that's what I like the most, because I guess like for me at least, I think I spent such a long time in the wine industry just reading about wine. So everything for me was a wine marketing, luxury wine marketing, or, Jan C. Robson did some books, so I bought. So everything was for wine. So let's get a wine from Argentina. Let's get a wine from Australia. Let's get wine from this, let's from that. So everything was about wine. Everything I was reading was about wine. And then, we started to get the same cut off with writing. And then one day I started to open my mind and it just see other things is not wine. And then I think that's how I started to actually writing better. And the beginning was terrible. And at the beginning, my husband said, like, doesn't make any sense. Doesn't flow. What are you doing on this text, But it get better with time. And then what I like the most, I think as started to get a type of writing. I think it's like at least for blogs, that's what I like the blogs. It's more authentic to yourself, because sometimes for writing for formal things, you need to get a little bit more structure. But let me know, how was for you that big change, how writing for blogs, how writing for magazines? Do you use the same techniques or not?
No, I probably do. And I will admit, having started as a columnist who wrote essentially 800 words, I am very comfortable at around the 800, 500 to 800 word length. I get massively unconfident when it gets to the several thousand word length, at which point essentially I start to knit together multiple pieces that are about 800 words long. So, if I have to do a 4,000 word book chapter, it's essentially 4 or 5 articles that I've kind of crammed together in one form. There are things that really, really help. During lockdown, I wrote a book. It was because I'd done some work, thanks to Robert Joseph and Polly Hammond, actually, with Chateau Malatic-La Gravière, and we'd done some online content with them. And each one of them was a kind of a 500-800 word length script, and it was all about Bordeaux. And I turned it into a thing, and you then get the problem. This was a failure. I wrote a lavatory book about red Bordeaux called On Claret, and every publisher, my agent, was like, you must be joking, a slightly amusing lavatory book about Bordeaux, nobody's going to read that. And of course the problem was what I'd got was 50 something chapters of about 800 words in length that were variously about Roman emperors and some interesting bits, and for me were very interesting. What they have been very useful for actually is I published them when I started on Substack, and I probably actually made more money selling them as a Substack premium subscription than I did actually going and publishing it as a book. What I do find is, you said about going and finding inspiration elsewhere. I do read wine books, and there are some really good ones. I'm quite selective, about which wine books I go and read. One of the things I do tend to subscribe to is the what's known as the barbell theory of reading. If it came out in the last few weeks, I'll read it. If it came out 50 years ago and people still talk about it, I'll read it. I tend not to read a whole lot that sits in between, particularly not things that sit in the "it came out 5 years ago" department.
Okay,
because
good to know.
It's known as the Lindy effect, which is this sort of idea. Was it King Adolphus, what was his name? He was a Spanish king, and he said that the best things in life: old friends, old wine, old books. Old books. So one of the things I read a lot of is a guy called P. Morton Shand, who, as it happens, by weird coincidence, is Queen Camilla's grandfather. Queen Camilla of England, King Charles's wife, her father was a wine merchant and her grandfather was quite a famous wine writer in his time, much forgotten about now. Now, what that means is you're reading about this wine writer who, in his time, was considered one of the greatest wine writers. John Betjeman, who's the poet laureate, he said he was the man who taught our generation how to enjoy wine. Reading him is fascinating. A lot of it is very, what we would consider unpolitically correct. He broadly didn't think that women had any sort of business choosing wine or having a cellar, and didn't think they were particularly mentally suited to it. So, in that sense, it's sort of outrageous. There are other things he wrote about, the notion of manipulating and industrializing wine that we find very familiar to us. They feel very, very close to us. His worldview was good because he wrote 3 books. One was called A Book of French Wines. His second was called A Book of Wines Other Than French. He tells you about the splitting wine. And his third was on Bacchus, and it was more of a polemic, actually. There's an entire chapter that's just called Prostitution, which is mostly about how terrible it is to make wine sparkling. He thought that was prostituting it. And he sort of had this view. He reckoned that if sparkling wine was akin essentially to communism and jazz music, and that it was going to bring down Western civilization. That's quite funny. But also, he's really interesting. So there, he's writing in the 30s, and I really enjoy reading that stuff. I equally really go and love reading people who are publishing Substacks and things, particularly actually Substacks. It's a nice platform, who are doing stuff that was last week, last year, even in the last sort of year or so. The sort of dullest area outside textbooks really is what people wrote kind of 3 or 4 years ago, because 5-10 years ago, because that's now sort of weirdly dated. And we don't know which of those bits will subsequently be proven to be immensely true. So, I do a lot of that. I often get weird. One of those things in terms of how do you make things go. I read a lot of copywriting books and I speak at copywriting conferences. On the whole, whatever sentence you just wrote, cut it in 2. Listen, endlessly. Yes, you can start a sentence with the word and. So mostly it's, whatever word you used, see if there's a shorter one. And ideally one that, if you're in English, comes from an Anglo-Saxon root, not from a Roman or Greek one. Those tend to be, it's a sort of arcane way, but you start to find that. He says using the word arcane. There's a really good clip on YouTube. Go and look it up. It's Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the guys who created South Park. Now you think, what? You get South Park from South Park is one of the most beautifully written scripts, and they have this rule. It's a really good clip where they go into I think it's a writing course, it's a degree course, and they go to these students, and the students are like, oh my goodness, it's Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and they come in and they say, we follow this really simple rule. What they do is they lay out the story in 3 acts on the board. Essentially, you want to lay out whatever you're writing, even something really short, in 3 acts. So what's the origin of it, what's the question, why did you go into the woods, at what point do you get the kind of midpoint where there's a kind of turning question, how do you resolve it at the other end? And they say, what we do is we lay out all the beats. So all the things, Cartman does this, Stan does that, such and such happens. And they go, if any of those 2 are connected by the words and then, we can't use it. They always have to be connected by the words but or therefore. There you go. So but or therefore. So such and such a thing happens, but this thing happens. Therefore, that thing happens. Therefore, that thing happens, but this thing came in the way. If you get to a thing where you go, there's this, and then there is this, what you've got is essentially just a series of disjointed points. And I do see a lot of writing where somebody goes, well, there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, which is why I really hate bullet points, and people do presentations. If you've got bullet points, it's just this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And that doesn't follow, there's no flow, there's nothing taking me along with you. Whereas if you write stuff narratively, and you go, well, there's this, but such and such a thing causes a problem in that. Therefore, you have to go and do X. And you might say X, Y, and Z, ideally in 3s. But then we've got to go and consider such and such. So you end up creating this much more interesting kind of flow to your stuff. And people feel text as much as they kind of read it. It's not just about transmitting information and, sort of, well, here's X amount of info. Let's kind of hand it over to you. Sort of
about feel again, yeah. Because the feeling is much more important than actually anything else. Is just pass the information without feeling. It's becoming very, very cold. It's not engaging. But you know, for your views, like you see, like all the communicates we have in the wine industry today, we have plenty, and then different platforms, blogs, Instagram, LinkedIn, because social media became like much easier for communicators to communicate. What do you see, like, if people could improve on, like, a general comment, how people could improve on the platforms so they communicated in the wine industry? There is anything that you'd like to explore or talk your advice people?
The three things. Notice I keep coming back to the three things. Go and listen to Obama's speeches, actually, because he always points out how there's this, and there's this. And then sometimes you go, but the opposite of that is the other. And so some of those kind of flowy kind of bits. No, there's probably three bits by it. One is, by and large, communicating is a very lonely profession. It's a very lonely sort of job. I see this a lot in marketing. I blog a lot around the world of wine marketing. And sometimes somebody once sort of said, why are you sort of, hanging on wine marketers? They do really good stuff. The truth is, actually, we have amazing marketers in the wine business. People are absolutely committed and love what they're doing, and they're really passionate about it. They're really amazing people. The problem is, there's one person there, there's one person there, there's one person there. The reason Treasury or Accolade or any of these other businesses are able to go and have really good marketing is not they have better marketers. It's essentially agglomeration economics. They shove them all in a room. Like, remember those Brownian motion experiments where you sort of get more and more gas and you sort of compress it, and all the particles bounce faster and faster and faster off each other, and they come up essentially with more energy. Humans are kind of the same. If you just one marketer kind of on your own, you come up with an idea. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? I don't know. And so you end up sort of going with the ones that are kind of guaranteed not to be shit ideas, but they're on the whole actually not that exciting. If you're at Treasury, where you're with a group of marketers and you get together and you're testing each other and you want to be better than that person and you want to sort of achieve more, and then that person really inspires you, so I think a lot of, where communicators get good is where you get a lot of them together, but they're different. So sometimes I do see groups of people where you get a group of communicators who come together and they work as a sort of group, and yet in many ways, of course, what they're essentially doing is just telling each other they're amazing. What you really want to be is in a group of people where you're kind of thinking, no, I don't necessarily agree with what you're doing. I think that there's another way, not being unpleasant or anything about it, but if you've just got a group of people who all just go, you're so good, you're bloody amazing, you won't actually create anything better. You'll just essentially amplify. That's why, you get these comment pods on Instagram. That's why, partly because they're bad because they game the algorithm and so on. But I think comment pods, Jamie Good's written about this. One of the problems is a meta effect, which is essentially people get told that pretty mediocre, boring stuff is amazing because the comment pod goes, oh, you're amazing, that's fabulous. Actually, no, it's not amazing, it's not fabulous. And you're not testing boundaries, because one of those things, you've got to get together as a group of people. The other bit is then you got to sort of, was it Niels Bohr, the physicist? He had that, I'm paraphrasing, he had that line that the opposite of a good idea is very often a very good idea. In sciences, the opposite of a good idea is the wrong answer. When it comes to sort of particle physics, the opposite of the correct answer in particle physics is the wrong answer in particle physics. In the social sciences, in arts, in culture, in media, the opposite of a really good idea is very often another very, very sort of good idea. Now, you take that sort of idea, and we would, I know we've talked about this in the past, there's an awful lot of conversation about how do you get millennials and so on board, and how do you get sort of Gen X's. Now, actually, that's not a bad idea. It's a pretty good idea to go and find ways to target groups of millennials. The thing is, you can look at the social cohesiveness. People score these things. You look at the social cohesiveness of millennials and Gen Zs. Gen Zs actually particular. They are less socially cohesive than people who floss in the morning, or people who play crosswords, or people who drink Orangina. Now, the opposite of going and targeting millennials or Gen Zs is going and targeting people who floss in the morning. Turns out that's an even better idea than targeting millennials. It's a sort of weird example, but kind of numerically that is true. When you look at the world that way, you go, maybe not targeting people who floss, but are there ways of going and finding groups of people, many of whom may well be younger consumers in general, that really captivates and engages, people in the world of wine and so on. So that becomes it. And then, of course, the third part is look outside the world of wine. But, I see a lot of people, they look inside the world of wine for really good inspiration. I think when you look at people who've done really well and people who do interesting stuff, the wine show, we went away and made the wine show, people can you can like it or not. I mean, some people really like it. 100 million people quite liked it. Other people really didn't like it. There were some people who, it wasn't really for them at all. The one thing, remember when we did it, a lot of people said, I don't think wine people are going to enjoy this. A lot of the people who didn't really like it, and I'm not criticizing them, they just didn't like it, were people who were inside the wine bubble. That was very deliberate, because what we did is we essentially said, let's go and do stuff that, remember one thing was we did say, I think slightly half jokingly, but it turned out to be true, we hope we get a really critical review from somebody inside the wine world. And bless him, actually, it was Jamie Good who came up with it. Now, if I targeted the sort of people that Jamie talks to, and talks to brilliantly, I don't know, we've got 1 million people. And we'd have probably been really chuffed. We'd have said, wow, we have 1 million people watching this TV show. But actually, people who are really into wine are a subset of, the total population of wine drinkers, let's say 5-10% or something. So we then went and said, well, let's go and make a TV show that's a bit like Top Gear, 3 people bumbling around, having fun, not taking it terribly seriously, but underneath it all actually having some genuine expertise, and digging out sometimes quite touching stories. I mean, some of the stories were I was in tears more than once a series, because there'd be some story go, oh my God, this is terrible. Either that or they'd nearly killed me. I remember I passed out. I ended up in hospital when I ran the Marathon de Medoc, when I was fitting. I was sort of jerking uncontrollably on a hospital table because I was so dehydrated. I remember having an absolute freak out when they shut me in a barrel and left me for an hour in the sun. It was like that scene in Papillon. It was Steve McQueen or whatever. They left me out, and I was properly hammered inside a 400-litre barrel in the Loire, because that was how they used to transport spies around France during the war. So there are times when I literally kind of in tears, and there are also times you met people who just go, this is really heartbreaking. I remember when we went to where the Chilean earthquake had been in 2010, and there was a tearful moment there. But we went and looked at something that was nothing to do with wine at all, and we said, well, what if you went and did that and you kind of looked at the wine world through this sort of format and structure of a totally different thing? And of course, 110 countries in the world pick it up and show it on their TV. So those sort of, I'm trying to remember what the sort of first sort of bits and pieces are, but that kind of thing of looking outside the wine world and saying, that structure, I'll go and apply it, in the world of wine. I'm going to go and look for the opposite of what everybody else is doing, and seeing if that may be quite an interesting way of tackling this topic, and not looking, and also then just finding other people. If you can find a group of people online or in friends, and people who will challenge you, there's a slight case. I'm going to have to be very careful. You do get a tendency for identitarian groups. Now, actually, there's a really good argument for going and having identitarian groups, people who are not particularly well represented in the world of wine, in going and having that. That's good in as much as it elevates people who don't currently have great representation into having a greater representation. Where it becomes a problem is that you end up with something of a sort of hype loop of people saying, well, you're kind of great, and you don't get people looking outside that bubble and saying, well, what if we went and did such and such? So I'm a real fan of where you get interesting kind of mentorships, where essentially you get somebody who comes in and goes, well, actually, this might be quite useful for you, and have you ever thought about doing it this way? It's a bit mad, but you should try it. I think those are those helpful? I don't know.
It's so amazing. It's amazing because for your experience, it seems like I always see you pushing yourself to not be stuck in the wine bubble. And I had completely different experience. I was in wine bubble for so long. And then when I had a friend, she told me like, oh, let's do like a YouTube like a series and things like that, and visiting wineries. I wanted to do like talking very serious about wine, and taking very serious approach, a very wine expert approach. And then this guy was the video maker, and he looked at me, he's like, no, Priscilla, that's not gonna who's like, it's gonna be such a short, it's gonna be engaged with this. No. Let's do different. Let's make it like a little bit more fun and more engaging. And I'm glad they actually get that experience, because I think it was from there key things start to change in my mind. But it's funny because I got it so much on the winding bubble in one way. If you tell me something else, I was correcting you. I was fine with you, so much in the bubble. And so funny because I don't know why I was behaving like that, because outside of my work, I was completely different. But my friend was telling me, like, Priscilla, but in your work, you just seem so different. Why are you so different in your work? It seems like you put a mask on you and it just doesn't look like you. It's so serious. I was like, completely different.
There was
But I guess,
it's a great,
and for something
there's this
you
little
didn't
sort of
even
rule we had.
notice.
No, we had this little rule when we made the show. It wasn't so much a rule, it was one of those things that kind of emerged when we were doing it. And I suddenly realized that the best bits were the ones where Teddy, who was the sound guy, essentially forgot what his job was. So if you're a sound person making a TV show, essentially your job is not to concentrate whatsoever on what's being said, but to be listening for things like, rustles, aeroplanes going overhead, a fire alarm, siren, making sure that things actually connect to the camera, so it's all kind of connected up. What you have to do is essentially listen for everything that's not the guy who's doing the talking, the person who's doing the talking. And we used to do these bits where every so often Teddy is this really lovely, very relaxed guy. He's the most amazing climber. He was an extraordinary climber. He would film for about 6 months and then he'd just go away climbing for 6 months. He would just earn enough money and they'd go climbing. He was a lovely man. And you always knew, or I always knew I'd done something really good when Teddy would come across and he would ask me a question about what I'd just been talking about, or he'd say that was really interesting. Because essentially, to have been interesting and captivating enough for somebody whose literal job was not to listen to what you're talking about, had ended up listening to what you were talking about, and you'd sort of drawn him in. And he never did that if it was anything kind of techy. He would always go and do that if it was something that was an interesting story, it was a narrative. But one of those things I really noticed, he would do it if it was something that connected into a thing he already knew about, essentially something in the real world. When I was an academic, I used to teach a lot of classes around this sort of notion of structuralism. God, don't get me started on structuralism. But a lot of the sort of theoretical framework of this was the notion that the way we think of things, the way we understand concepts and objects, is that essentially everything has to connect to something else in your brain. So a cat is kind of, and a lot of it's about negation. So a cat is not a dog and it's not a this, that, and the other. But you sort of know things in relation to all the other things that you know. And then when you learn new things, you don't just learn them in isolation. They don't just sort of sit in a box. You know them because they connect to all these other things that you kind of know. Now, when you talk about wine, it's often entirely unconnected to anything else that's in somebody's brain. It has no real connection because they, on average, people in Europe can only name, I think it's something like 4 grape varieties, maybe 5, something like that. In China, it's only 2 or 3. So when you
Brazil and Malbec only.
Yeah, that's Malbec.
That's the only one.
So then you suddenly realize this thing where almost everything you're about to sell to people is entirely unconnected to stuff that they already know. And I remember there's one example we use, this is quite a useful way of sort of illustrating it. When I talked about, it was Hungarian dry ferment as a sort of grape variety. How do you go and introduce that to a group of people? And also, how do I introduce that to groups of people with differing levels of wine knowledge? Because often, there's no such thing as the wine consumer. There's lots of different ones. Some people know a lot, some people know little. You kind of have to get both of them, all of them in one thing. I remember at one point I said, it's really interesting because it's a half sibling of Chardonnay, so it has that lovely structure and sort of universality of Chardonnay. It's also a half sibling of Riesling, so you get this sort of aromatic thing. And of course, Riesling is what real wine experts always think of being as this sort of great, sort of great variety, and they adore it. And so I said, it becomes it's very practical thing to go and choose because it sort of goes with everything, and it's interesting, and it's got all these sort of structures, and on the whole they don't export anything unless it's really pretty good dry ferment from Hungary, so on the whole you're kind of guaranteed a good bottle. And I remember saying to somebody, because the best thing about it is that if you choose that on a restaurant wine list, you're the person who chose the Hungarian dry white wine. What kind of a person does that, except for somebody who really knows their way around a wine list? And now, in the first bit, I'm talking to the expert audience. They go, oh, it's quite interesting, half siblings. The second bit, I'm talking to the non-expert audience. What they know is wine expertise. They know that status of wine is very important. And you're there saying, here's this quite funny thing where if you go and choose this wine, it's kind of guaranteed not to be shit. It'll pretty much go with everything, but it makes you look like a total baller because you're the one who's chosen the Hungarian white on the list. Oh my goodness, I was going to go for the Sauvignon Blanc, but you really know your stuff. And of course, when people try it, I mean, it's always one of those great things. It comes in a weird shaped bottle. They go, but I thought it was a pudding wine. Oh no, you see, it's dry ferment. This one you can actually pronounce it because it's ferment. It's not like harsh level, which is sort of impossible to pronounce.
Different way.
That's that bit where you're connecting it to somebody's neurons, or sort of biologically, in a way that they kind of link it to their own lived life experience. And I think that becomes an important part of how you start sort of engage. And that was what I would do. And then Teddy, the sound man, was like, oh yeah, I'll go and buy that. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, thanks very much. You know, sort of see him. The cameraman was very good. We had a guy called Jamie comes from West Midlands. He's probably listening to this. And Jamie would like, I don't want any more of that swirly, sniffy. And so every time I did like, enough of that sniffy, swirly. It's just get rid of that, you know. And I think that's that area. As soon as we started talking, I realised the crew, and this is a challenge when you're on your own. Having your crew's really nice. You know, Jamie had been sent to Borstal for nicking cars or something. You know, he'd had quite a rough childhood. I have to go and engage with a guy who's a total artist. I mean, he was, you know, his cinematography was just extraordinary, and he's technically, you know, what he was able to go and do, it made me look good, was phenomenal. But I've then to try and make it so that he, as a guy from pretty rough background, whose life is entirely built around cameras and lenses, actually finds and doesn't drink wine. I have to sort of make him sort of engage with it, and that's a really interesting sort of hard challenge. But if you do it, of course, you know, lots of people like it.
That is the secret to be able to be communicating this digital age. Yeah, is just to be able to connect and relate to things, because I guess you see lots of people try to communicate as a wine expert with very technical knowledge, and I don't think that sits in the brain for most consumers. It's not gonna match, like it's not gonna come in like that doesn't come like natural. They just connecting things. You needed to try to connect with a different way, with something like more related to them.
And there's a nuance to this. There's a thing lots of people do is they'll go and ask a question. Hey guys, what do you think of such and such? Now, one thing you see, and go and have a look at posts, and you'll often, you know, engagement. One of those things you'll see is that often that's done in order to get engagement. You know, like, share, and subscribe. Now, what people are asking when you do that is, can you go and do something that goes and tells this algorithm, a thing that doesn't really exist, but it's sort of a theoretical thing, to go and suggest I'm immensely popular. So, you know, if you enjoy this, like this. Hi guys, put a comment below if you do such and such. Now, it actually comes out of something not terrible, which is that sort of sense of engagement, but it goes somewhere absolutely horrendous, which is all it really does is in service of the algorithm. Where there's something really interesting, and again, this is going back, so I really enjoyed the book called, it was a very complicated, quite a long book. I would recommend reading it. A book called Cybernetics by Norbert Wiener. But Norbert Wiener, he had this sort of idea that actually where you got real intelligence was essentially by getting feedback loops all the time. It actually came from his work in the war designing anti-aircraft guns. This is where really interesting inspiration often comes. So he comes up with this idea. Cybernetics is nothing to do, when we think of cyber today, we tend to think of it as electronics. Actually, cybernetics comes from a Greek word, Kubernetes. I'm probably pronouncing it very wrongly, but essentially it's the Kubernetes was the person who steered a ship. And constantly, if you're steering a ship and you're on the tiller like this, you're constantly reacting to feedback. Oh, there's a wave there. Oh, the wind has shifted. Oh, the people rowing the ship across to Thermopylae have gone the other way. You know, they're sort of pulling on one side. You're constantly responding. And he came up with this sort of notion that actually it was a really interesting intelligence, which was, how do you constantly respond to this feedback loop that you're getting all the time? There was a guy who was really inspired by this guy called Howard Gossage. Howard Gossage was an ad man in the 1960s, and if you got nothing from this podcast, go away and learn about Howard Luck Gossage. He's an absolute genius. And Howard Gossage essentially creates interactive advertising and interactive communication before there's anything to be interactive with, because he's writing in the 60s, 50s, 60s, early 70s. And he would put lots of coupons in all his ads. So he'd have those, you know, classic 1950s ads with a little coupon. The coupons often asked you slightly daft questions. he would sometimes ask you things like, what are you planning to go and do today? What did this thing make you feel? He would ask really stupid questions. He had a famous campaign for a beer brand, Rainier Ale, where essentially he asked people whether or not they should repeal the 19th Amendment that gave women the vote. And he said, did we think that we should repeal the 19th Amendment because women are drinking Rainier Ale, which is for men? And you could write in and you'd get a badge. One badge would say, I agree we should repeal the 19th Amendment. The other said, I absolutely disagree. We shouldn't repeal the 19th Amendment. Now, the point wasn't that he was particularly one where, he was actually, as it happens, he was the most amazingly progressive employer for his time. But what he wanted was people to write in, because then they would write in and they would be sort of outraged. And then he would be able to go, well, it turns out we made a terrible mistake with this. And this is such and such from, Idaho. She says that we shouldn't. And he was able to go and use that feedback to create new campaigns and to create new interests. So when people sort of do the like, share, and subscribe, all it does is it tells the algorithm, I persuaded somebody to go and click on a button. If you do that thing of challenging someone with a question where not necessarily they get outraged, but it can be something that's really interesting. I mean, he was the man who invented the Great Paper Aeroplane competition, which essentially just got lots of people to make paper aeroplanes, and it still runs today. It was for Scientific American. That way, he would go and create these really interesting feedback loops where people go, I've made this even better paper aeroplane. This is completely phenomenal. And so I think, if you're going to go and do something, it wouldn't be like, share, and subscribe. It would be, what shape does this wine make in your brain? Now, it turns out there is an old German method of wine tasting known as the Gestalt method, which asks you to picture the shape of a taste or an aroma. Now, who cares if there's a right answer or the wrong answer? It's quite an interesting kind of fun thing. Some people
it's an interesting question.
It's like clouds and pillows. Oh no, to me it's got little spikes that come out of it. Now I've got this sort of thing of, now I've created these representations, the 4 bizarrest representations of the wine shape that if people get out of this one thing. That's really interesting. So that's actually proper cybernetics. The idea of cyber, like cyberpunk, that comes somewhat later. People take cyber, which was never meant to be on its own, they take that away and they start to apply that in this sort of world of kind of digital, because essentially cybernetics requires this vast amount of computing power to be able to go and make it work well. And this is that thing, cybernetics, by all what we know, it's written more than, it was like 60, 70 years ago, something like that. I find that really inspiring now, in how do you go and create stuff that goes and gets interesting feedback loops that go and give people sort of interesting content. So, I do my wine facts of the day. It's not every day. Crack, I'd run out really quickly. Well, I do sort of wine facts of the day on Instagram, which essentially, the last one was, what was it that connected Lord Byron, Blackbeard the Pirate, and Queen Rosamond of the Lombards. And they're all connected by drinking wine out of skulls. So Byron drank wine out of a skull and wrote a poem about it. Blackbeard's own skull was turned into a drinking cup, and they used to drink wine out of Blackbeard's skull. And Queen Rosamond, this is the worst, her husband, King Albion, he made her drink wine out of her father's skull, which he used to carry on his belt. And in an act of extreme cruelty, he said, drink out. And he sort of said, look, isn't it marvelous? It was something along the lines of, isn't it father and daughter drinking happily together again? And she was so it was so awful, she eventually managed to have him assassinated. She drove him. That's the act of cruelty. Now that actually came out of me doing something else, and then somebody said, oh, go and read this thing, and then I go and read that thing, and then it suddenly turned up and there's an Economist article that I happened to be reading about something related to that, and it told me about the story of Queen Rosamond. I kind of remembered about Byron and his poem, and then I quickly looked up and I thought, oh, crikey, that's quite an interesting thing. And then somebody said, turns out Blackbeard's skull was turned into a wine drinking cup. Actually, there's loads of people whose skulls have been turned into wine drinking cups, and that's how you get there. Now that's a cybernetic process. Essentially, I do a thing, it spins you off into another thing, and it connects you back to the original thing. Now, people might like it or not like it. But I did a post the other day about, somebody got me on, they were talking about, our wine is really good with picnics. So we've done it in this way, nice enough picnic. So I thought it was quite interesting. And I just did a bit of searching. I was just, over lunch, I'm kind of playing around with one of picnics. And it turns out, I was like, I wonder where the word picnic comes from. And it turns out it comes from a thing called the Picnic Society, which was started by French aristocrats after the revolution in about 1800 in London. And originally picnics were
I
indoors.
didn't even know
They weren't
that.
outdoors at all. It was on, now what got really interesting, I then looked in and I thought, I wonder if they drank wine at early picnics. Turns out they absolutely did drink wine at early picnics. And in fact, there's a rule book. So the rules of the Picnic Society, picnic, 2 words originally, were that you had to bring a main course to come along and 6 bottles of wine.
6 bottles of wine? Seriously?
Ahead. And apparently they went mad. I mean, they were properly raucous, these picnics. So then I did this thing that said, how many bottles of wine should you take to a picnic? It turns out that actually is a number. The number is 6. And I told this story. I mean, to date, I think that post, it certainly had well over 1 million views. I think it's been like 38,000 times, 35,000 times, something like that. It has in that sense gone sort of viral. I mean, I'm not Tom Gilby viral. Anybody know Tom Gilby who gets that every time he posts, but that comes out of a thing where somebody goes, my wine's quite good with picnics. You just go, oh, it's quite interesting. I've never really thought about that. Cybernetics, connect, come back, get a post, 1.1 million views or whatever it is. I think I got about 4,000 more followers off that one post.
Wow. This is actually a good thing, because I think because that post, you wrote in on the post about the influences to be famous, I wanted you talking about that, because that was one of your text, like on your platform. You talk about what's about influences. I don't remember the title, but it was talking about the influences and to be famous, and then actually in the wine industry. I think because we're talking about the story, how you can get that million of views. No, millions of views on this post. But it's very interesting because you told me something in the last time you talked, and you said to me, the influences, it's a very important because they're famous, because more famous you are, you're creating more. It's like Penfolds in Australia, for example. They are famous. They're a famous producer. So when you're working like me, working in retailers, I had people looking for Penfolds, and they have Penfolds in their mind, And I guess it's just something we needed to making people realize in the wine industry, because there are not many brands people actually remember, at least not in my experience. Like, we did a study in Brazil, and then people ask, like, what's the wine brand they most like it? Do you know what's the winner? Malbec.
Yeah. Yeah.
Malbec was the winner. Like the most well-known brand in Brazil, like wine brand. So we're very bad in the wine industry to actually making like big remarkable brand. If people actually remember about the brand, I think it's just a few wineries can do this, but I have the wineries do that very well. But yeah, let's explore that.
There's really interesting. We sometimes have very binary thinking. I think social media, because it's a binary technology behind it, it's like that's the right answer and that's the wrong answer. Sometimes, often, they're both the right answer, and indeed they can sometimes both be the wrong answer. Fame is a really interesting one. If you want to be famous, if you go into social media or communicating wanting to be famous, you're probably the person who oughtn't to be famous, actually. I mean, on the whole, the worst thing you should go and do. I quite like standing up in front of a group of people. I never had some great desire to be famous. I'm not like the sort of thing, I really, really hope lots of people go and know me. And to give you an idea, I only ever travel on flights with a collared shirt, because I'm always terrified, quite often in airports. It's the one place people stop you, is in an airport. And I'm always terrified I'll go and have to do a photograph of somebody and I'll look like a schlub. So I always I fly long haul, always with a collared shirt in case I get asked for a photo. So if you want to be famous, that's a terrible reason for going and doing this. It's not like you shouldn't, but don't do it because you want to be famous and you want to sort of. However, at the same time, fame is massively important. There's an incredibly famous ad man, a guy called Jeremy Bullmore, and you can read his annual letter to shareholders. You can find it on the WPP website, and you'd look up Jeremy Bullmore, and they are works of genius. There's a particularly good one called on Plonk and Placebos, which is about how labels on wine work. It's actually wine related. It's really interesting about the placebo effect of wine labels. But he once wrote, if a client was to ever come with the perfect brief, it would simply say, "Make me famous." And he had this sort of idea, and I wrote about this idea of sort of Bullmore fame. What I defined as Bullmore fame is famous outside of your target market. So the wine industry is actually very good in many ways at creating non-Bullmore famous products. So within the world of wine, amongst the target market, the brand itself is quite famous. There are relatively few Bullmore famous wine brands, or indeed Bullmore famous wine personalities. Now, I don't know whether I am one. One of those bits is I get lots of people, for the weekend, somebody watched the show and they say, "I'm not really a wine drinker, but I really enjoyed your TV show." That's essentially Bullmore fame, because that wasn't really, it's beyond the target market of kind of wine drinkers. A wine drinker likes it. Well, obviously it's a wine show and you'd be expected. Matthias Rosé is essentially Bullmore famous. People who don't drink wine are aware of Matthias Rosé. They go, "Oh, I just quite like that." 19 Crimes actually is probably, arguably. Penfolds to a degree. Certainly Cununga Hill in its heyday was kind of Bullmore famous. Lindeman's been 65. I mean, now a much, diminished brand, but Lindeman's been 65 in its time, was a sort of Bullmore famous brand. So that sort of idea, fame can be both a good thing and a bad thing. Pursuing fame is a terrible thing. Actually being quite famous is a worthy thing to go after. So both things are true, even though they sound kind of the opposite. And I think when you sort of sit down, you sort of look at a product or a brand or such and such, rather than getting terribly worried about, well, how do we go and target this group? How do we go and do such and such? A much better policy is to go, how do I make this thing famous? It's a great line. We're all in the entertainment business now. This is one of the reasons I really rile against the idea of using the word consumers. Consumers implies a passive group of people who sit there and essentially consume. So they sit there and you fire stuff at them. It's much better ways to think about an audience. So if you have an audience, you send something out and they tell you whether or not they thought that was good. This is the cybernetics thing. You fire the thing out and they go, "Hooray," or they go, "Boo." And when you're performing on stage, of course, you get that real-time thing. I wouldn't necessarily, you don't have to go and do this. It's not a terrible idea to go and do stand-up if you're wanting to be a communicator. In fact, you want to do anything, go and do stand-up. It's horrendous and it's utterly terrifying, and you shit your pants. I did a cold open. So it was like the first act on a Friday night in Comedy Cafe in North Hollywood. Introduced, I remember sort of going out, and I didn't die on my backside. It wasn't far off. I did 7 minutes, which actually is a very, very long time. I mean, that feels like 20 hours when you're on stage. And I did 7 minutes.
Really?
I got some quite nice laughs, yeah. Now, when you do that, of course, the reason it's kind of hard is, if I write a blog post, most people ignore it. Few people say yay. 1 or 2 people might go, "Well, that was a bit boring." If you do stand-up, unless you're amazing, it's horrible, because they're just sort of sit there staring at you. If you do cold open, nobody's G'd up, they've not got warmed up yet. So they're just sort of sitting there. I can get till I told my Bill Clinton gag, just absolute silence. But then you get this very visceral sense of throw the thing out there, get the thing back. That's where fame comes from. It's from talking to an audience that responds, rather than consumers who just sort of fire stuff out. And that's why I think the wine business on the whole should ban the use of the word consumers and endlessly talk about audiences. Or did that audience respond well to that? Not, I'm sending this towards consumers. When you got consumer, it's like a cardboard cutout and it says, ABC1 female aged XYZ comes from these postcodes. An audience is a real life human being who goes, "Well, I didn't think that was very nice," or "I thought that was bloody amazing," And then it takes a lot of judgments away. People get really critical of like critter labels. I'm writing a thing at the moment about critter labels. The extraordinary thing is, everybody goes, this modern phenomenon of critter labels. The Harrods wine list in 1900, most of the Australian wines have critter labels on them. And actually what Australia has done really, really well is to understand that the audience liked a picture of an emu. And it liked a picture of an emu in 1900s. It still likes a picture of an emu now. That's because you're talking to an audience in that way. And it was really interesting because you look at the way sort of Bordeaux, was sort of more expensive wines. Australia was marketing itself because it didn't have that heritage in 1900. It was marketing itself in the same way, which is essentially, what's a thing that's got two eyes and a mouth that I can legitimately put on the front of a label, because it's a deep psychological level. People quite engage with things that have got two eyes and a mouth and think is quite cute. Right, we'll put an animal on the front. Yes. And that's why critter labels really, really work.
And what you say is like, because I understand, like, just making that like the message. Consumers, when you talk consumers, it's always about the people actually already consuming my product. If I say audience, I can actually tell, like, if people don't drink my product or don't use my product, but they can use it. So, or they can make a convert in a new consumer. I think that's, for me, it's such a very good way to communicate. I love that. Thank you. We're going to use my next post. It's like, no consumers anymore, going to be audience, because that's exactly. So consumers is the persons engaging with your product in a way you just keep engaged, but audience can be some people outside the people who already consume your wine. That's right. That's exactly what you explained. And then
exactly
that's amazing. That's amazing, because I never thought in that way. Thank you. I just wanted to give every episode. I just wanted to give like, for everyone who's watching this, like, the 3 advices for people actually watching this. So, like, people wanted to communicate better for the social medias. People wanted to write better. People wanted to make sure then making the message clear and engage. 3 short advices for people actually can start tomorrow easily. How they can actually making their communication better now. Like, we know the digital way is engaging, and we need to engage people, engage the audience. Love that. And then, like, I wanted just 3 advices, very short advices, so people actually can thinking how they can actually use data devices in their business.
I'm delighted. The number one thing is answer a question. So when you want to go and write a post or talk a post, always have, in a sense, the fact that you are answering a question. Humans naturally have in our brain essentially a 3-act structure, which is, there's a question, we go into the woods to go and get into the weeds of it, and we sometimes get a little bit lost, and we emerge at the other end a slightly improved person for knowing the answer to that question. So when we look at if you go away and look at my Instagram, you look at that picnic post, I ask a question: what's the correct number of bottles of wine for a picnic? We disappear into the woods, we find out about French aristocrats, and we come out this, that, and the other. And we come to the other end with a slightly nice resolution, which is, well, it turns out it's 6 bottles. And we go away and have a party. And now you've got that loop. So you're closing the loop when you do that sort of thing. So that is number one. I sometimes quite like to give people something really, really specific. If you are writing, go and get a program called Hemingway app. Grammarly kind of does the same thing, but I much prefer Hemingway app. And Hemingway app, you write something and then you drop it in, and it color codes how terrible your writing is. And when I say your writing, I mean my writing. So I will often write stuff and I drop it into Hemingway app. You can use it for free. I happen to have the downloadable paid version that you can use on Macs. And one of those things it does is essentially it makes you write like Ernest Hemingway. I know Ernest Hemingway had this very short aphoristic style of writing. You go away and read, The Old Man and the Sea or whatever. I think the last one I read was Sun Also Rises. And he has these very short, punchy sentences. Now, Hemingway is really easy to read because these sentences are very short. And often where you've got long, complex sentences, he shrinks them down and he'll turn them into 3. And he does things like, I always cut out the word that. You almost never in English need the word that. So it's the first thing I always do is like go, anytime I've used the word that, I sort of cut it out. There's usually a better way of going and doing it. Most sentences in Hemingway, it'll give you a red line if it's a really difficult to read sentence, a yellow line if it's quite difficult to read. It'll ask you to remove passive verbs. The ball was thrown. No, he threw the ball. So you always sort of do it that way around. Passive verbs people find quite hard to read, so you do it that way. So when you go through Hemingway up, it suddenly cuts it short, and then you can go into areas of learning it more. The one thing I often say to people, if you out of good writing technique, the one thing to always hunt for is a thing known as left branching sentences. So when you think about the way you structure something, start with the really important piece of information first and then go into the detail. So he kicked the ball and it went out and then flew back to him because it was very windy. That is the way you ought to go and write it. The wrong way to go and write it is because it was very windy at the time the guy kicked the ball. When he kicked it out, it blew back to him. And what that makes my brain do is I have to hold this information, which says it's very, very windy, in my head, not knowing quite why I've been told this information until I get to the point later on in the sentence, at which point, now you might think, well, that's not that hard. It's really hard for brains to do that. The brains really hate having to hold information for a period of time before they get the resolution. So any of you writing it, given that Chardonnay is such a difficult grape to grow in warm climates, no. There is no Chardonnay grown in the Sahara Desert because it's really difficult to grow it in warm climates. Sorry, that's probably a terrible example. Riesling, there we go. You start with the sort of solid piece and you add layers and layers of information on it. So that's one. First thing is answer a question. Second is go and have that sort of sense of Hemingway app, and then learning some of those sort of little bits and pieces of stuff. And then the third part is whenever, certainly if you've written anything or if you're going to talk anything, if you've got any kind of a script, go away and read it out loud. If you ever write a newspaper article, go and read it out loud. Everybody always says you should write in the way that you speak. Well, go and speak it, and you'll be amazed how terrible some of your writing is, because you'll try and so often I'll do a voiceover of my Substack article, and then I get to the end of the voiceover and I was like, no, I've got to rewrite that because it was terrible, because even I couldn't read it out. And so I then go back, redo the thing, and I redo it as if I've written it. So sometimes I even actually dictate stuff. Remember, Churchill won a Nobel Prize for Literature. Churchill barely wrote a thing. He used to stand at a high up desk, would have all his notes out, and he would dictate what he was writing to secretaries, and they would write it down. Now, we don't all have chest high desks and secretaries to take our notes whilst we're sitting in the bath. And famously, he also used to dictate things in the bath. But Churchill's writing sounds terribly fluent and fluid because he was essentially standing up and just dictating it to people. So often, when you look at the way people write, Hemingway has this amazing thing. You put stuff in, it'll tell you what American grade should be able to understand that. And often I go and read stuff and somebody says, oh, crikey, what do you think of this? And I drop it into Hemingway, and you realize that essentially you need a postgraduate education to be able to understand what's being read. And it's web copy. If you're writing web copy, 6th grade, 5th or 6th grade is what you essentially, you want to be talking to, children, really quite young children, because not because you're talking to young children, but because people are skimming it, they're flying through it. So it needs to be super easy to read. So my Substack, I'm mostly talking to people who've got degrees, they've passed the diploma, they're really, really bright people, but they're on a tube. Or they're on the bus, or it's their lunch break. They're not reading it as a textbook. So I want to write to them as if they, in the style of an American 6th grade child, 5th grade child. I think in America, federal documents by law have to be below 7th grade. They have to be understandable at 7th grade. And there's a really interesting part where you can take presidential inaugural addresses. I've done this. I've taken certainly Barack Obama's first and second address, which are heralded as great pieces of oratory, extraordinary writing, and they are, they're great pieces of rhetoric. You drop them into Hemingway, and essentially they come up as being readable by kind of 10-year-old children. But that's because it's a federal document, and the law says, well, it has to be read, it has to be understandable by 10-year-old children. So when you think about writing an inaugural address, because of this rule, this law that it has to be understood at this level, they are doubly amazing, because not only are they these extraordinary pieces of rhetoric, they have to be understood. And, you take the Gettysburg Address, it's only 4.5 minutes long, and it's lasted, and it's incredibly easy to understand and read. So, don't mistake complexity and depth for being necessarily intelligent. If you want to get your message across, answer a question, drop it into this sort of platform, make it uber easy to read, and then what will come out at the other end, people will go, and if you're easy to read, people will always think you're cleverer. The two things that make people think you're cleverer, one is that they could understand it, and the other is that you're funny. It's actually quite hard to be funny. I mean, I would say go away and be funny, but it's really, really difficult. But it's certainly a thing to aspire to. And people sometimes go, and it's a very serious piece, I oughtn't to be, I oughtn't to tell jokes. Actually, behaviorally, people will think you're cleverer if you make them laugh. So yeah, a bit. If you want to go and find my bio piece, I wrote a bio piece about what's the celebrity clean wine. It's about clean wine. Who was the actress who created a clean wine, and she was in Shrek, and there's something about Mary. And so it's on the Bayer website, and it's about clean wine. And as it wrote, clean wine makes me feel dirty. And it's the woman who plays Princess Fiona in the Shrek movies, and she has Cameron Diaz's wine. And that was a piece where I deliberately set out to be quite funny about it. And actually, I tell quite a serious story, which is kind of how celebrity wines work and how the nature of presenting this as clean has this bizarre rhetorical effect that, of course, everything else by definition has to be dirty wine. So it's actually quite an interesting kind of version. But somebody said afterwards, they said it was really interesting. Said it was a very insightful piece, but the main thing was it made me laugh. And there are various layers of joke. There's a really, really rude joke in it, incredibly rude joke in it. But most people don't get it because most people don't notice. And that doesn't matter because some people notice the very rude joke that's in the text. Now we're just going to go and read and see.
But I think that's the secret for life anyway. Making people laughing is always a great thing because people it's almost connect with you if people just give a smile. I remember in Argentina, I did not speak any English, Spanish, but I just made people laugh, making people laugh so much. I was like one of the most triple divisive person. That girl from Brazil speaking Portuguese with Spanish, mix it up. She was so funny. She was amazing, At the end of the day, we just want to, have a little bit time for them. And that's probably why Instagram gets so much likes and views when you see something funny. So we just need to, it just need to be clever. It's not taken the wrong way. But
my wife, what was that? My wife won't stop whining. I wish I'd never bought her that vineyard. That's a terrible joke. That was one of the jokes of the year at the Edinburgh Festival. I tell you the joke I wrote a piece. It's actually not a joke. It's a true story. When I was doing stand-up comedy, it's slightly rude this, but I wrote there is an American grape variety. The only president who shares his name with the grape variety is Bill Clinton. And it's true, there is a grape variety that is called Clinton. Yeah. I remember I discovered this when I was writing this routine. I only had 36 hours to write the routine. In the middle of the night, I write this thing. And it's like, there's this grape variety called Clinton. And weirdly, I have tried it. In Italy, it's known as Fragola. And when you try it, it's a Teinturier. So it's a hybrid, but it's got really thick skins. And of course, it's got red juice on the inside. And I wrote this line. I said, which was true. I said the one time I tried Clinton, somebody said you have to be very careful with Clinton with this dark skin because it can stain clothing, which is a terrible, slightly rude joke about Bill Clinton. So some people will get this and they'll go, "Oh my goodness, don't ever tell that joke again." It wasn't a particularly good joke.
Anyway, Joe, I would like to say thank you so much for the interview.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much for the pleasure to have you as teaching us about communication skills. It was amazing to be able to talk about your stories. Yeah, it would be like an hour and a half of this episode. But it was so engaging. And I think people are going to love it. People are going to watch it to the end. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate that. And then please keep on doing what you do. We love this. And then, we are here to always be learning from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.